At the U.S. Army Ordnance Proving Grounds in Aberdeen, Maryland, the winter wind cut across rows of half-assembled tanks, hulking shapes of olive-drab steel and raw ambition. Beneath the echoing rafters of Building 311, engineers in coveralls argued in the language of armour thickness and muzzle velocity, their voices rising above the clatter of rivets and the groan of hydraulic presses. What began as routine testing of the M4 Sherman had become something else entirely, an awakening. By early 1944, the American tank program was under quiet siege, not from enemy guns, but from battlefield reports trickling back from Europe and Italy. The Sherman, that dependable, mass-produced workhorse that had carried American divisions across North Africa and Sicily, was being mauled in Normandy. The Panther, the German Panzerkampfwagen 5, was cutting through U.S. armour columns like a scythe through wheat. A memo from the 2nd Armoured Division, dated July 1944, was pinned to a corkboard in the Ordnance Analysis section. Enemy tanks open fire at ranges exceeding 1,500 yards. Shermans cannot reply effectively beyond 800. Penetrations are frequent, even on the frontal glacis. Another note, scrawled in pencil across the margin, read simply, "We're outclassed." At Aberdeen, Colonel Joseph Colby, head of the Tank Automotive Branch, traced his finger across a cross-section drawing of a Panther's gun. 75 millimeters, he said, almost in disbelief. High velocity. KWK 42L/70. Their shell leaves the barrel at over 3,000 feet per second. He looked up at his engineers. "Gentlemen, our 75mm M3 is an antique." The men in that room were not blind to logistics. They knew the Sherman was not built to win duels. It was designed to win a war of movement. America could produce 50 Shermans for every Panther. Spare parts, transportability, fuel. Those were the pillars of McNair's doctrine. General Leslie J. McNair, head of Army Ground Forces, had long resisted the notion of heavy tanks. He called them wasteful and unnecessary. His belief was doctrinal, even moral. The United States would win with mobility, numbers, and the air arm, not lumbering behemoths that clogged ports and bridges. Yet in France, that doctrine was burning. A captured German intelligence briefing, translated and circulated by G2 in August 1944, revealed how the enemy saw it. American armour is tactically inferior. Sherman is fast, yes, but undergunned. Panther engages freely at long range. One Panther may engage 4 or 5 Shermans before withdrawal. At Ordnance Headquarters, that statement felt like a gauntlet thrown. The first glimmer of a countermeasure had begun a year earlier in the experimental bays at Detroit Tank Arsenal. There, engineers had quietly tested prototypes designated T20, T23, and T25, evolutionary designs that abandoned the Sherman's narrow chassis and vertical volute suspension for torsion bars, wider tracks, and heavier guns. The T23 carried a new 76mm cannon, while the T25 mounted a 90mm, an adaptation of the Army's anti-aircraft weapon, the M1. On paper, it could pierce a Panther's armour at 1,200 yards, but McNair's voice haunted every conference table. "Heavy tanks will slow operations," he insisted. "We need reliable tanks in quantity, not superweapons." In Washington, his doctrine carried weight. In Europe, his words were costing lives. In July 1944, an engineer named Robert Kellner returned from France with first-hand accounts from the 3rd Armoured Division. His debriefing was grim. "Our tankers call the Panther the murder cat. They can't flank fast enough. Our 70s bounce off its front plate. We get close, but at the cost of 5 tanks for one." The room went silent. Kellner laid a spent shell casing on the table, a 75mm AP round recovered from a Sherman's gun. The nose was flattened like a coin. "This struck a Panther at 900 yards, he said. "It left a mark, nothing more." Behind him, a photograph projected onto the wall. a burnt-out Sherman on a Norman road, its turret blown askew, white stars charred black. "Our boys aren't lacking courage," Kellner said. "They're lacking physics." The phrase circulated through the corridors of ordnance, lacking physics. Meanwhile, intelligence officers began dissecting captured German equipment at Aberdeen's ballistics range. A Panther's glacis plate, angled at 55 degrees and 80 millimeters thick, deflected everything the Americans threw at it. The KWK-42's tungsten core shells, on the other hand, punched through US armour cleanly. The contrast was humiliating. In September 1944, Ordnance Chief General Gladian Barnes visited the range personally. He watched as a prototype 90mm M3 cannon roared, sending a shell through a steel block designed to mimic a Panther's side armour. The block shattered. "There," Barnes said. "That's our answer." Still, the Army's bureaucracy lagged. Convincing McNair's successors to approve large-scale production was a political battle as much as an engineering one. The tankers in Europe were pleading for relief, while the shipping officers in New York warned that the new design, heavier by 10 tons, would strain transport logistics. The T26 project, as it was now designated, faced resistance from every quarter except the front lines. Eisenhower's staff cabled the War Department directly. Combat experience clearly demonstrates the need for tanks superior in firepower and protection. Our current models are no longer adequate. In October 1944, the 12th Army Group sent a detailed after-action report to Washington. Its summary line was damning. The German Panther outclasses the Sherman in all aspects except reliability. For the first time, even the ordnance bureaucrats could not ignore the arithmetic of destruction. In the hedgerows of Normandy, in the streets of Saint-Lô and Caen, American tank crews learned that courage and manoeuvre meant little against a gun that could reach them from a mile away. By winter, production orders for the T26E3 were finally approved, an emergency program that would later yield the M26 Pershing. Only 20 were initially allocated for combat testing in Europe, under what became known as the Zebra mission. But in the closing months of 1944, that was still a dream. The men in the Aberdeen testing sheds worked double shifts, sleep-deprived and determined, measuring armour plates by flashlight, running weld seams with frost on their breath. In their minds, every hour saved meant fewer Shermans burning on European soil. Late one December night, a test firing rattled the proving ground. The new 90mm thundered, and the recoil shuddered through the floor. The shell struck its target, 5 inches of German steel salvaged from a wrecked Panther, and punched clean through. Silence followed. Then one engineer, his voice half disbelief, half triumph, said softly, "Gentlemen, we can kill it." But as 1944 turned into 1945, that victory remained theoretical. The reports from the Western Front were still grim. At Bastogne, during the Ardennes counter-offensive, American tank units faced Panthers and Tigers in the snow and fog, and still the 75mm guns failed to penetrate. "We hit them 5 times before they hit us once," a tanker wrote home. "The difference is, one of theirs is enough." The gap was not of courage or industry, it was of steel and time. In the long corridors of Aberdeen, the engineers now spoke in hushed tones. They knew what they had built, but they also knew it would come too late for many. The Pershing's birth would be measured not only in tons and millimetres, but in blood already spilled on the fields of France. And so, in the anxious winter of 1944, as draftsmen inked the final blueprints of the T26, one thought echoed in every hangar and foundry. America would no longer send its tankers to fight with physics against them. The era of the Sherman was ending. The age of the Pershing was about to begin. Eastern France, summer-autumn 1944. The morning haze of August 1944 clung to the rolling fields outside Chartres, veiling the black silhouettes of the German armour that crouched among the hedgerows. Panthers, sleek, angular, menacing. Their long 75mm guns pointed west, across a landscape already rumbling with the approach of American columns. From his cupola, Oberfeldwebel Karl Hoffmann of the 2nd Panzer Division adjusted his Zeiss binoculars. "Shermans," he murmured, spotting the specks of movement 2 kilometers away. Always Shermans. The Panther had become a creature of both engineering and mythology. Among German tankers, it was a symbol of survival, a predator that, even in defeat, commanded fear. In training manuals and mess hall boasts, they called it Der Löwe Europas, the Lion of Europe. With its 75mm KWK-42 gun and 80mm sloped frontal armour, the Panther was said to be impervious to any Allied tank fire except at suicidal range. That belief was both weapon and curse. When Hitler had unleashed the Panther in 1943 at Kursk, it had faltered, mechanically fragile, plagued by engine fires and transmission failures. But by the time it rolled into France in 1944, those flaws had been mostly corrected. The crews who manned them were veterans hardened by the Eastern Front, where duels at 2,000 metres against T-34s were commonplace. Against the Americans, they expected a massacre. And often they got one. At the edge of a Norman village, a Panther from the 116th Panzer Division waited hull down behind a rise. Its commander, Lieutenant Erich Brandt, watched an advancing US column through the smoke of burning farmhouses. "Range, 1,400 metres, his gunner called. "Target, lead tank." The retort was like thunder in a cathedral. The 75mm round shrieked through the air, a tungsten core arrow that struck the Sherman square in the glacis plate. In an instant, fire erupted through the turret seams. The crew inside had no chance. The next Sherman edged forward, firing wildly. Another shot from the Panther, another bloom of orange and black. In less than 3 minutes, 4 Shermans burned. The German crews laughed grimly, their confidence renewed with every hit. "The aim is build tanks like sausages," one Panther driver sneered, watching the horizon, "and we roast them just as fast." But behind that arrogance lay exhaustion and fear. The radio crackled constantly with desperate calls for fuel, for air cover, for ammunition that no longer arrived. Each victory felt hollow when followed by the hiss of siphoned gasoline and the grinding march on foot. By late August, the Panzer Lehr Division, once the pride of the Wehrmacht, had been reduced to half strength. Its Panthers, still lethal, now operated as isolated wolves, striking swiftly before vanishing. The German supply lines had been shredded by Allied fighter bombers. For every Panther that destroyed a Sherman, another sat immobilized for want of spare parts or fuel. Still, to the Americans facing them, the Panther seemed invincible. Reports from the 3rd Armoured Division described engagements in which entire platoons of Shermans were lost before closing to effective range. "Our guns can't touch their fronts," one lieutenant wrote bitterly in his combat diary. "The only way to kill a Panther is to flank it, and to do that you have to lose half your tanks getting there." At headquarters, American commanders adjusted tactics in desperation. Air support was called in wherever Panthers appeared. Tank destroyer units, M10s and M26 with 90mm guns, were rushed to the front. Infantry learned to stalk the beasts with bazookas, grenades, and even satchel charges. "A Panther's rear is its weakness," instructors said. The problem was living long enough to reach it. For the Germans, the Panther's dominance brought not relief, but a grim fatalism. They knew the Allies had endless reserves of tanks, men, and gasoline. Each skirmish they won was another hour's delay in an inevitable retreat. "We kill 5, 10, 20 Shermans," Hoffmann wrote in his journal, "but for every one we burn, 2 more appear behind it. They come like a tide, never ending." The myth of superiority became a psychological trap. Crews grew contemptuous of orders to withdraw, believing that no Allied tank could best them in a stand-up fight. but when the skies darkened with P-47 thunderbolts, confidence turned to terror. Armour meant nothing when a 500-pound bomb struck the earth beside you. At the Loire River, a Panther company from the 9th Panzer Division attempted to hold a bridgehead. Their commander, Hauptmann Victor Lau, remembered the sound first, a distant droning that rose into a scream. "Jabos!" someone shouted. The thunderbolts came out of the clouds, strafing with .50 calibers, then dropping rockets that tore through the German column. Panthers burned on the bridge, their crews clawing out of hatches into flames. When the smoke cleared, 3 Panthers remained from 12. The road to Paris was open. Even in ruin, the Panthers' aura persisted. Captured American tankers spoke of facing them with a mixture of dread and respect. "If you saw that long gun in the tree line, you knew someone was about to die," recalled Sergeant William Lucas of the 33rd Armoured Regiment. The only good thing about a Panther was that if you survived the first 2 minutes, it might break down trying to chase you. Mechanical failures became the Germans' silent enemy. Overstrained engines, transmission failures, cracked torsion bars. The Panther was a masterpiece built for a nation that could no longer afford it. As the Wehrmacht retreated eastward, mechanics stripped abandoned Panthers for parts, often torching what they couldn't move to deny them to the Allies. In October 1944, a captured Panther was shipped to the Aberdeen Proving Ground. Engineers swarmed over it like archaeologists examining the relic of a vanished empire. They measured, weighed, and tested every plate, every weld. "It's an engineering marvel," one of them admitted, "but it's overcomplicated. You can tell they're fighting desperation with precision." To the German tank crews, the Panther remained their last faith. When they met in the muddy bivouacs along the Moselle, they spoke not of victory, but of endurance. "We hold them today," one sergeant said, "because our gun reaches farther than theirs. Tomorrow, who knows? Tomorrow came sooner than they expected. In the factories of Detroit and the testing grounds of Aberdeen, the answer to the Panther was already being forged. The T26E3, a tank with a gun that could match the German weapon and armour that could shrug off its fire. The German crews didn't know it yet, but the age of their supremacy was measured in weeks. As autumn turned to winter, the Panther remained the king of the battlefield, but its kingdom was collapsing around it. Fuel convoys vanished under Allied air attack. Spare parts ceased to arrive. Orders came from higher command that sounded more like prayers than strategy. Hold, delay, resist. And so, on the frost-bitten fields of Lorraine, as columns of smoke marked another day's retreat, the men of Panzer Lehr and 2nd Panzer still believed that their steel lions could turn the tide. They did not yet know that across the Channel, in the holds of Liberty ships bound for Antwerp, a new beast was on its way, a tank born from their own legend, designed for one purpose: to hunt the Panther. Detroit Tank Arsenal and Aberdeen Proving Ground, late 1944. By the autumn of 1944, in the machine shops of the Detroit Tank Arsenal, the air smelled of steel, cutting oil, and exhaustion. Engineers worked under floodlights that turned the foundry's haze into something almost sacred. Here, amid the roar of presses and the hiss of welders, the Americans were trying to erase their greatest military embarrassment, that their army had gone to war with tanks that could not stand toe-to-toe with Germany's best. The Panther had been dissected, measured, and cursed. Aberdeen's ballistic engineers had pried apart its suspension, weighed its armour, and catalogued its weapon like priests examining a pagan idol. Their conclusion was simple, humiliating, and undeniable. The Sherman's 75mm gun could not penetrate the Panther's frontal armour at any reasonable combat range. Colonel Gladion M. Barnes, chief of the Ordnance Department's Research Division, made his judgment in a terse memo to Washington. "We require a tank capable of meeting the Panther on equal terms, firepower, armour and optics, nothing less. His weapon would be the T26E3, a machine conceived in frustration and born of engineering defiance. It would mount the 90mm M3 gun, the same piece of ordnance that had already proved capable of downing German aircraft at 10,000 feet and punching through a Tiger's side armour at 1,000 yards. But building a new tank was one thing, getting it to the battlefield was another. Standing in the way was General Leslie McNair's legacy, still embedded in Army Ground Forces doctrine. Even after McNair's death in Normandy that July, his philosophy haunted every production meeting. Mobility over weight, reliability over complexity. Heavy tanks, the staff officers said, would bog down in French mud, overload shipping, and burn too much fuel. The Sherman, they argued, had won North Africa, Sicily, and Italy. Why replace what worked? But Barnes had seen the casualty reports. At St. Lo and Mortagne, Sherman crews had died in droves trying to outflank Panthers that could pick them off from a mile away. Every success had been purchased in blood. "Our boys are brave," Barnes told his engineers, "but courage isn't armour." So, in defiance of inertia, he ordered prototypes built. The T20 series came first, low silhouettes, electric turrets, and improved suspensions. Promising, but undergunned. The T-23 mounted a 76mm cannon and an electric transmission that fascinated engineers but terrified logisticians. Too complicated. The T-25 brought a 90mm gun, heavier armour, and a 45-ton chassis, and with it the beginning of the T-26 line. At Aberdeen, a prototype was test-fired in October 1944. The 90mm M3 spat a shell that tore through a captured Panther's glacis plate at 1,200 yards. The steel rang like a church bell, and the observers went silent. "There," Barnes said quietly. "That's the sound of parity." But even with the proof in front of them, bureaucracy slowed everything. To ship a 46-ton tank to Europe meant redesigning bridges, barges, and transport cars. The War Department hesitated. Eisenhower, thousands of miles away in France, did not. His cable to Washington was blunt. "The need for heavy tanks here is urgent. I request immediate delivery of 90mm gun tanks to ETO." That order birthed Operation Zebra, the code name for the shipment of 20 T26E3 tanks to Europe for combat trials. The crews selected for the mission were from the 3rd and 9th Armoured Divisions, veterans of Normandy and the Siegfried Line. They arrived at Aberdeen to train under conditions more suited to laboratory tests than battlefield chaos. Engineers hovered around them, clipboards in hand, as if the men were test pilots for a secret weapon. Staff Sergeant Robert Early, one of the chosen tank commanders, remembered seeing the Pershing for the first time. "It looked like a Sherman that had gone to the gym," he said. "Same outline, but lower, broader, meaner. When you swung that 90 around, you knew it meant business." The crews were taught the new hydraulic traverse, the improved periscopic sights, the 3-inch thick frontal armour plate. For the first time, an American tank could meet a Panther head-on without flinching. "You could feel the weight," Early said later, "not just in the steel, in the confidence." At the Chrysler Arsenal, production teams worked double shifts. They stripped down designs, simplified welds, and welded plates by hand where machines fell behind. Every tank had to be perfect. There was no time for repair units to learn on the fly. By December 1944, the first shipment of Pershings was loaded onto Liberty ships bound for Antwerp. The cranes strained as the massive tanks were hoisted aboard, dwarfing the Shermans parked beside them. As the ships steamed across the Atlantic, the Battle of the Bulge erupted. Reports from the Ardennes were catastrophic. Panthers and Tigers spearheading through snow and fog, Shermans burning in clusters, American tank units retreating under withering fire. Eisenhower's headquarters at Versailles sent another cable to Ordnance. "We need those new tanks now." The irony was cruel. The Pershing had been ready for months, delayed by committees. Now, as Europe froze under Hitler's last offensive, The machines that could have stopped it sat on the decks of ships somewhere in the North Atlantic. At Aberdeen, the test ranges stood empty. The engineers who had stayed behind waited for word of how their creations would perform in real war. They passed the long nights in the drafty barracks, listening to the radio reports from Europe, Bastogne surrounded, Patton racing north, the lines holding by inches. Barnes wrote in his journal that week, "It will not be the best tank that wins this war, but the one that arrives in time." The Pershing's time had come, but whether it would arrive soon enough was uncertain. On the factory floor in Detroit, a young welder scrawled in chalk on the inside of a turret before it was sealed shut. "Send this one to Germany. We owe them a visit." When the cranes lifted the next Pershing into the Atlantic dawn, its olive paint still tacky under the cold mist, no one in that shipyard could yet know that one of these tanks, number 38, would soon duel a Panther in the ruins of Cologne Cathedral, and that when its 90mm gun fired, it would change the balance of armoured warfare forever. Cologne, Germany, March 6, 1945. The air over Cologne was thick with smoke and the echo of falling masonry. After months of brutal fighting across the Siegfried Line, the 3rd Armoured Division rolled into the city, its columns advancing like weary metal beasts through the shattered bones of the Reich. Every street was a canyon of ruin, burned-out trams, collapsed facades, and the smell of cordite lingering like an open wound. Among the column was one of the new M26 Pershings, freshly unloaded from Antwerp only weeks before. Its name, scrawled in white chalk on the gun barrel by its crew, was Fireball. Commanded by Sergeant Clarence Smoyer, the Pershing had been the object of curiosity and quiet hope since it arrived. To the Sherman veterans around it, the tank looked like something from the future. Heavier, meaner, and blessed with the thick armour and long 90mm gun that could finally challenge the feared Panthers. That morning, as the armoured column entered the city centre, scouts reported a German tank hidden near the Cologne Cathedral, the twin spires looming above the wreckage like sentinels. The Pershing crew was ordered forward. Every block they advanced carried a sense of both dread and destiny. Somewhere ahead, an ambush waited. At the intersection of Komödienstrasse and Marzellenstrasse, they found it. A Panther Ausfrems A, camouflaged amid the debris, its 75mm gun already traversing toward them. The crews saw each other almost simultaneously. "Panther! Dead ahead!" shouted gunner John de Riggy, sighting through the periscope. Before Smoyer could give the order, the Panther fired. The shell struck the front plate of Fireball, gouging the paint but failing to penetrate. Sparks flew, and the tank rocked back on its suspension. "Hit! No hole!" Load AP exclamation mark de Riggy barked. Loader Truman Evans rammed the heavy armour-piercing round into the breech, the smell of grease and hot metal filling the turret. De Riggy adjusted, exhaled, and squeezed the trigger. The 90mm gun thundered. The shell streaked across the street, hitting the Panther square in the side of its turret. The German tank jerked, belched smoke, then caught fire. Flames poured from the commander's hatch as its crew scrambled out, too late. A second round from Fireball tore through the engine compartment, sealing the kill. For the first time, an American tank had defeated a Panther in direct, head-on combat. The moment was caught by a combat cameraman crouched behind rubble, a film clip that would become one of the most iconic pieces of footage of the war. Inside Fireball, the crew sat in stunned silence. Then Smoyer broke the stillness. "That's for every Sherman that burned before us." Word spread quickly through the division. The Pershing's baptism had not only proven its worth, it had vindicated years of engineering, argument, and loss. The men of the 3rd Armoured began to believe that the tide of steel had finally turned. But victory came too late to change the war's course. By the time more Pershings arrived in Europe, the Reich was collapsing. The Ruhr pocket was forming, the Rhine crossings secured. Most Shermans that remained were now supported by air supremacy and artillery, the edge the Allies had always held. Still, among tankers, the Pershing's arrival carried symbolic weight. It was America's long-delayed answer to the Panther and Tiger, the closing of the steel gap that had haunted them since Normandy. At the edge of Cologne, Smoyer's crew parked Fireball and climbed out to watch the fires consuming the city. Church bells rang somewhere through the smoke, faint, defiant. Around them, infantrymen moved like ghosts through the rubble, rifles slung low. The Pershing's 90mm barrel still smoked faintly. In its reflection, the men saw the end of one era and the beginning of another, the moment when the US Army finally met its enemy on equal terms of iron and courage. By the end of March, only a few Pershings had seen combat, yet their brief presence had already reshaped doctrine. Engineers and officers back in Detroit and Aberdeen took note. The next war would not be fought by massed light tanks. It would be fought by giants. As Fireball stood amid the ruins, its armour blackened and its crew weary but alive, a single phrase seemed to echo in the minds of all who saw it. Too late for this war, but just in time for the next. April-August 1945, Western Germany and the US Ordnance Board. The Pershing's triumph in Cologne spread across the Western Front like a whispered promise, proof that the Americans could finally stare down a Panther or Tiger without praying for a flanking shot or air cover. Yet the timing was cruel. By the time the 3rd and 9th Armoured Divisions received their new tanks, the war in Europe was already gasping its last breath. Only 20 Pershings saw frontline action before VE Day. They arrived piecemeal, trucked through muddy French depots and rushed across the Rhine on pontoon bridges under the roar of Allied aircraft. Each one was greeted with a mix of reverence and resentment by Sherman crews who had survived months of attrition. "Where were these damn things in Normandy?" one sergeant muttered, touching the thick front glacis of a new M26 as if testing a myth. In the chaos of Germany's collapse, the Pershings rarely faced their intended prey. The vaunted Panthers and Tigers were dying not in duels, but in ambushes, bombings, and fuel starvation. The Reich had run out of everything: oil, crews, and time. Still, in the few engagements that did occur, the Pershing proved itself merciless. At Remagen, where the Ludendorff Bridge gave the Allies their first crossing of the Rhine, a handful of Pershings guarded the bridgehead against desperate German counterattacks. One knocked out 2 Panthers at 1,200 yards with 3 rounds, the third blowing the turret clean off. After-action reports from the 13th Corps praised the tank's accuracy and crew survivability. Enemy fire failed to penetrate frontally at normal ranges, one officer wrote. The 90mm gun's effectiveness exceeds expectations. Recommend continued production and deployment. But even as the tankers celebrated, the bureaucrats debated. In Washington and Detroit, the Ordnance Department and the Armoured Board at Fort Knox began to argue over the Pershing's future. Critics pointed out its flaws: the same gasoline engine as the Sherman, overburdened by 10 extra tons of steel, mechanical teething issues, underwhelming speed on poor roads. The Pershing was powerful, yes, but slow to build, slower to maintain, and already outdated by the standards of engineers looking ahead to jet-age warfare. General Jacob Devers, a long-time advocate for heavy tanks, defended it fiercely. "We asked our boys to fight Tigers with Shermans. Never again," he wrote to the War Department. But General Leslie McNair's legacy lingered even after his death in Normandy. The doctrine he had championed, mobility over mass, numbers over armour, still shaped procurement policy. "The Pershing is a fine weapon," one ordnance colonel conceded, "but the war has been won without it." The irony was bitter. The tank built to close the steel gap had arrived only in time to watch Germany burn. Its debut had proven America could match German engineering, but not fast enough to matter strategically. When victory came in May, many Pershings were parked in depots, their treads still caked with Rhine mud, their barrels clean and unused. Crews posed for photographs beside them, unaware that these machines would soon be shipped not home but east, to new battlefields under new flags. For the war in Europe had ended, but another horizon was forming, the Pacific. Reports from Okinawa told of Japanese anti-tank ambushes and concrete fortifications that laughed off 75mm shells. The Ordnance Board began drawing up new deployment lists. The M26, born from panic and perfected too late for Europe, was now being readied for the invasion of Japan. Mechanics repainted their hulls olive drab and stenciled fresh shipping codes. The tank that had finally silenced the Panther was about to face an entirely different kind of enemy, not armour but empire. And in that quiet between wars, one truth settled among the engineers and soldiers who had built and fought in steel. America had learned its lesson the hard way. The age of the light tank was over. From now on, no army of democracy would ever go to war undergunned again. June-August 1945. Okinawa, Tinian and Ordnance Command, San Francisco to Manila. When the guns in Europe fell silent, the men of the 3rd and 9th Armoured Divisions scarcely had time to rest before hearing the new orders. Prepare for redeployment to the Pacific. The war with Japan still raged across the islands, and Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Kyushu and Honshu, demanded every available armoured division. In the humid summer of 1945, the M26 Pershing began a new journey. Crated aboard Liberty ships and Victory freighters, the tanks left Antwerp and Southampton, crossed the Atlantic, and were offloaded at American West Coast ports, San Francisco, Seattle, and San Pedro. There, they were reconditioned, fitted with deep wading gear, tropical filters, and the Pacific olive paint tone used by Marine armour units. At the San Francisco Ordnance Depot, a young Army engineer named Captain Walter Swanson wrote in his report, "We are shipping weapons made for Europe to fight a war of coral and caves. Yet the Pershing is the first tank I've seen that might survive what's waiting on Kyushu." Meanwhile, in the Pacific, the Battle of Okinawa was grinding toward its bloody conclusion. The Army's 713th Tank Battalion, equipped with Shermans and flame tanks, fought yard by yard against Japanese bunkers and reverse-slope guns. Tankers there had learned to fear the hidden 47mm anti-tank guns that ambushed from caves, and the suicide teams that ran beneath tanks with explosives strapped to their chests. When news reached them that heavier tanks were coming, with twice the armour and a gun that could shatter concrete, morale lifted, if only slightly. "Maybe this one'll live long enough to see the beach," one gunner wrote home. By July, the first M26s had arrived on Tinian and Leyte for evaluation. Crews trained under the blazing sun, learning to handle the 45-ton monsters in tropical terrain. Engineers built experimental track extensions for mud and coral. Ordnance officers tested the 90mm shells against reinforced Japanese bunkers, noting with grim satisfaction that one shot could breach what had taken Shermans 3 or 4. But the Pacific was a different kind of battlefield, not one of armoured duels, but of fortresses and cliffs, of jungles that swallowed engines whole. The Pershing's size and weight became both blessing and curse. It could withstand almost anything the Japanese fired at it, yet moving it through narrow trails, swamps, and shallow harbours was an ordeal. Still, the logic was simple. If America invaded Japan, it would need Pershings at the front. The planners of Operation Olympic estimated over 1,000 would be required in the first wave alone. Production lines at Detroit Arsenal rumbled back to life, and new orders were issued to ship entire battalions of M26s by August. The crews who trained on them knew the stakes. Sergeant Bill Reese of the 9th Armoured Division wrote in his diary on July 31st, 1945. "They say the Japanese are building concrete tank traps all around Kyushu. The brass think the Pershing can take it. After what I saw in Germany, I believe them, but I'm not sure I want to find out. Then, suddenly, the war changed overnight. On August 6th, the atomic bomb fell on Hiroshima. 3 days later, Nagasaki followed. And on August 15th, Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled over Japanese radios, announcing surrender. For the Pershings waiting on the docks, it was a reprieve from a future written in blood. The invasion that would have cost hundreds of thousands of American lives never came. The tanks that had been destined for Kyushu remained in their crates, silent, untested in the Pacific crucible. Yet their voyage had not been in vain. As the occupation of Japan began, a handful of Pershings were shipped to Tokyo and Yokohama to serve as security and demonstration units. They stood in stark contrast to the burned-out wrecks of Japanese Heigo and Chiha tanks, relics of another era. Japanese officers, now prisoners, studied the Pershings with quiet astonishment. One former colonel from the Imperial 4th Tank Regiment remarked during interrogation, "We believed the Americans had no heavy tanks. This one is beyond anything we imagined." In the final weeks of 1945, as peace settled over a shattered world, the Pershing stood as a symbol of lessons learned too late. It had been conceived in panic, perfected in haste, and sent to war in its final chapter, a weapon born from defeat but destined for a new age. For even as the last Liberty ships returned home, ordnance planners were already drafting the next generation, the M26 Patton, an improved Pershing with a new engine and the promise of greater speed. The shadow of the Cold War was already falling. The Pershing had crossed an ocean only to find its war already won. But it carried within its steel frame the legacy of every Sherman that burned and every engineer who swore it would never happen again. As one ordnance officer wrote at war's end, "The M26 Pershing arrived too late for glory, but just in time to remind the world that America could build not only many tanks, but great ones." The war had ended, but the arguments had not. In the ruins of Germany and the laboratories of America, the story of the M26 Pershing was being rewritten, not by its crews, but by generals, engineers, and historians trying to explain what it meant. At Fort Knox, the U.S. Armored Board convened its post-war review in early 1946. Around a long oak table sat men who had fought through Normandy, the Ardennes, and the Rhine. Some wore ribbons heavy with campaign stars, others slide rules in their breast pockets. The question before them was simple and damning. Had the U.S. Army failed its tankers? Brigadier General Bruce Clark, veteran of the 7th Armoured, didn't mince words. "We built a tank for 1942 and kept fighting with it in 1944, he said. "The Pershing came too late to save men who died in Shermans that never had a chance." Across the table, an ordnance officer from Detroit countered, "We built what our logistics could support." The Sherman won the war because it moved. Heavy tanks win battles, but light tanks win campaigns. The debate echoed the old war between mobility and firepower, a philosophical fault line that had haunted the U.S. Army since North Africa. The Pershing had proven that American industry could produce a world-class heavy tank, but at a cost. It was harder to transport, slower to repair, and logistically hungry. To the men who had to ship millions of gallons of fuel and parts across oceans, the Sherman had been a logistical miracle. Yet for those who had fought in one, the Pershing represented something deeper, a moral correction. The film of the Cologne duel, shown during the board's closed session, made the point wordlessly. The flickering image of a Panther exploding under a Pershing's 90mm gun silenced the room. Colonel John Leonard, who commanded the 9th Armoured Division at Remagen, leaned forward. "Gentlemen, we can't ask our men to fight steel with tin again. Not ever." Outside the hearing rooms, the engineers at Detroit Arsenal were already working to answer that demand. They stripped down a Pershing and began re-engineering it, replacing the underpowered Ford GAF engine with a Continental AV 1790, reinforcing the suspension, improving the transmission. The result, tested in 1947, was the M26 pattern, the Pershing's faster, leaner descendant. But as the blueprints advanced, the political winds shifted. America's wartime arsenal was shutting down. Congress slashed defense budgets. Factories that once turned out Shermans and Pershings now made refrigerators and cars. To the public, the arsenal of democracy had done its job. Few wanted to fund the next war. Only a handful of men, ordnance officers, tacticians, and veterans, saw what was coming. In 1947, as tensions with the Soviet Union hardened into the Cold War, intelligence reports described new Soviet tanks being tested, the T-44 and T-54, both faster, lower, and armed with 100mm guns. For the first time, American strategists realized they were once again on the verge of falling behind. The lesson of Cologne, the price of complacency, was being learned all over again. Meanwhile, in occupied Germany, the Pershings that had survived the final months of combat were being used for trials and demonstrations. American officers tested captured Panthers and Tigers side by side with the M26, recording data meticulously. The results confirmed what tankers already knew. In firepower and armour, the Pershing was a near match for the Panther and superior in reliability. Against the Tiger, it held its own, and against anything lighter, it was untouchable. One Panther, recovered near the Hurtgen forest, was restored to working order for comparison firing. When the Pershing's 90mm HVAP round penetrated its glacis at 1,000 yards, the German observers, former tank officers now working for US analysts, nodded silently. "So," one murmured in English, "you learned from us after all." By 1948, the Pershing had become both a relic and a foundation. Most of its production models were reassigned to training units or scrapped for parts, their components feeding the birth of the Patton series. Yet its reputation grew in retrospect, a tank that symbolized the end of one war and the beginning of another. In technical manuals, the M26 was classified as a medium tank, but to the men who drove it, it would always be the heavy that came too late. And yet without it, America might never have built the tanks that would later face the T-34s in Korea, the T-55s in Vietnam, or the T-72s of later decades. When the Armoured Board issued its final report in November 1948, one line stood out. The M26 Pershing corrected at last the doctrinal errors that cost us so dearly in Normandy. Its existence ensures those errors need not be repeated. The report was stamped classified, restricted distribution and filed away at Fort Knox. Outside, on a quiet Kentucky field, a single Pershing sat rusting beneath a tarp. A test driver had scrawled a message on its turret in chalk before it was mothballed. Cologne, March 45, never forget. And for the next generation of tankers who would climb into the Pattons and later the Abrams, they never did. By the time the 1940s faded into the 1950s, the M26 Pershing had already become a paradox, a weapon both too late and too early. Too late for Europe's great tank duels, too early for the jet and missile age that was dawning. The last wartime Pershings sat in motor pools across occupied Germany, their olive-drab paint flaking, their barrels capped against the rain. The army was demobilizing, shrinking back into peacetime comfort. But the engineers at Detroit Arsenal and the veterans at Fort Knox had a premonition. History rarely allowed democracies to rest for long. That premonition came true on June 25, 1950. When North Korean forces surged across the 38th parallel, their Soviet-supplied T-34/85 tanks crushed the Republic of Korea's lines in days. US occupation troops in Japan, light on armour, heavy on complacency, were rushed to Korea in desperation. The first American tanks to land at Pusan were not Pershings or Pattons. They were worn-out M24 Chafees, the same light tanks that had been outclassed even in 1945. Their 75mm guns bounced off the T-34's sloped armour like pebbles. Infantrymen watched helplessly as their shells ricocheted, while the North Koreans cut through roadblocks with mechanical precision. In the chaos, the Ordnance Corps sent urgent telegrams to the United States. Request immediate shipment of M26 Pershings and 90mm ammunition. T-34s superior to all tanks presently in theatre. Within weeks, the first Pershings, relics of the European War, were pulled from depots in Japan and Okinawa. They were battered, their engines weary, but their guns were still true. Mechanics worked around the clock to replace cracked road wheels and leaking radiators. By late July, Task Force Smith had fallen, Taejon was in flames, and the Pershings were being loaded onto transports bound for Busan. When they rolled ashore, they were met by tank crews who had never seen one before. To them, the Pershing was a legend, the tank that had killed the Panthers, the weapon that symbolized American redemption. At the front, that legend was put to the test. In early August 1950, outside the town of Masan, a platoon from the 75th Tank Battalion engaged a column of North Korean T-34s advancing along the Valley Road. The terrain was claustrophobic: rice paddies, hills, smoke from burning villages. Sergeant Stanley Clark's M26 took position behind a berm, its gunner aligning the crosshairs at 900 yards. "Target, T-34, left of the bridge," the gunner called. The 90mm gun fired. The round struck the T-34's turret, blowing it clean off in a fireball that lit the valley. "Hit confirmed." Within minutes, the Pershings had destroyed 3 more tanks. The remaining T-34s retreated, their confidence shattered. For the first time in the Korean War, American crews realized they could fight on equal terms. But victory came with a warning. The M26's engine overheated constantly, its transmission failed on the steep Korean hills, and its heavy weight bogged it down in rice paddies. Mechanics cannibalized parts, using captured Japanese trucks to haul transmissions. The Pershing had power, but no endurance, a lesson the Army should have remembered from Europe. By late 1950, as General Douglas MacArthur pushed north toward the Yalu River, newer M46 patterns began arriving from the States. Pershings refitted with more powerful engines and improved drives. The M46s could climb the hills where the M26s stalled, and their speed gave the crews a fighting chance in Korea's mountainous terrain. Still, the Pershing earned its second reputation the same way it earned its first, in blood and mud. At the Chongchon River, under sub-zero temperatures, one Pershing held off an entire Chinese tank column through the night, firing until its barrel glowed red. When it finally ran out of shells, the crew destroyed their own tank rather than let it be captured. To the young tankers who followed, the Pershing was an anachronism and an idol, an echo of the armoured giants of Europe now fighting in Asia's hills. While the Pershings fought in Korea, the engineers at Detroit Arsenal studied every field report. The same debates that had consumed the army after Normandy re-emerged in the new decade. The lesson of Cologne, the cost of being technologically unprepared, was burned into every ordnance officer's mind. Chief Engineer Harold Young summarized the findings bluntly in a 1951 memo. The Pershing demonstrated the necessity of firepower parity. The cost of delay in design and production is measured not in dollars, but in men. Under his supervision, the M46 gave way to the M47 and M48 patterns, each iteration faster, tougher, and more maintainable. The Pershing had been a bridge, the experimental step between the fast, undergunned Shermans and the modern main battle tanks that would define the next half-century. In the training grounds of Fort Knox, new tank crews learned their craft on Pershings that had survived both wars. Instructors used them as cautionary examples. "This tank killed Panthers," one sergeant would say, patting the side armour. "But she came too late because men argued instead of deciding. Don't ever let that happen again." The lessons filtered up into doctrine. The Armoured School rewrote its manuals to emphasize combined arms, fire superiority, and industrial readiness. Never again would the army send tankers to fight without equivalent weapons. At the same time, historians began re-evaluating the Pershing's place in the war. The old myths of the Sherman's sufficiency dissolved under the weight of post-war analysis. The US Strategic Bombing Survey, cross-referenced with German war diaries, revealed the ugly truth. For every Panther destroyed in Normandy, several Shermans had been lost. The Pershing could have saved thousands, if it had existed a year earlier. In 1952, the Army officially redesignated the M26 as a medium tank, aligning it with the Patton lineage. It was a bureaucratic act, but also a symbolic one, an acknowledgement that America's heavy tank had become the foundation of a new philosophy. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, in the ruins of the Old Reich, a different army watched closely. The newly formed Soviet occupation forces studied the Pershings left behind after the war, just as they had studied captured Panthers and Tigers. In the archives of NYI 48, a Soviet tank design bureau near Kubinka, engineers dissected a captured Pershing and compared it to their own T-44. Their conclusion, declassified decades later, was blunt. The American M26 demonstrates excellent crew ergonomics and optical systems. Its fire control and reliability exceed those of the German Panther. Its armour and gun equal our own T-44 in protection and surpass it in comfort. That single analysis helped drive the development of the T-54/55 series, the tank that would become the backbone of Soviet armour for the next generation. In an ironic twist, the Pershing had helped shape not only the future of American tanks, but the tanks it would one day face. By 1953, the Korean War was grinding to its uneasy stalemate. The Pershings that survived were worn out, patched with field repairs and repainted in hasty camouflage. Many were left behind as static defences, their barrels pointed north across the DMZ. A few were shipped home, to training schools, to scrap, to museums. One, the famous fireball that had fought in Cologne, ended up at the Aberdeen Proving Ground. Visitors would walk past its scarred armour, unaware they were looking at the steel ghost of a turning point. Historians later called the Pershing the tank that arrived too late to change the war, but early enough to change the world. It had closed a technological gap that had haunted America since Kasserine Pass and Normandy. It forced generals to reckon with the cost of underestimating the enemy, and it set the stage for a new kind of warfare, one fought not in desperation, but in preparation. When the M60 Patton rolled out in the 1960s, its engineers traced its lineage directly back to the M26's design papers. And when the M1 Abrams debuted decades later, its 120mm smoothbore and composite armour carried the same philosophy born from those desperate days in 1944. Never again should an American tanker go into battle outgunned. In 1985, 40 years after the Pershing's duel at Cologne, a reunion of the 3rd Armoured Division was held in Fort Knox. Among the guests was Sergeant Clarence Smoyer, now an old man with steady hands and a quiet voice. On display behind him stood a restored M26 Pershing, polished and silent. When asked what he remembered most, Smoyer smiled faintly. "The sound," he said. "When that 90 fired, it wasn't like a Sherman. It was final. You knew the fight was over." He touched the side of the tank, the same armour that had saved his life on that March morning in 1945. Around him, the younger soldiers of a new generation listened in respectful silence, their olive uniforms different, but their profession unchanged. "The Pershing," Smoyer continued, "wasn't perfect. But it gave us a fighting chance. That's all we ever wanted." Outside, the wind blew across the training fields where Pattons and Abrams now thundered. Inside the museum, the Pershing stood beneath its plaque, M26 Pershing, the bridge between wars. It was more than a machine. It was the embodiment of a lesson carved into the memory of every soldier who had fought from Normandy to Pusan, that progress bought too late is paid for in blood, and that steel, no matter how strong, must always arrive before the battle, not after. And so, in the long shadow of the Pershing, the world's armies learned the truth that engineers at Aberdeen and tankers in Cologne had understood decades earlier. In war, there are no second chances for those who build too slowly.